I appreciate that introduction, Judd. That's very kind of you. I just want to share with you folks this morning that Judd is the impresario of the Jack London Piano Club. You're probably all well aware of that. Which is a position that he's held almost as long as I've been associated with the park. So it's great having his support for that program. It allows people who visit Jack London's House of Happy Walls Museum to hear the strains of a Steinway piano drifting in the background as they visit the park. It's really enhanced visitors' experiences for decades now. So thank you, Judd. My topic this morning is the life and times of Sonoma County's favorite son, Mark Twain. Oh, okay, well, I got the obligatory April Fool's joke out of the way. This rather daunting title slide probably gives you the idea that you're going to be suffering through a lecture this morning. This is a program that I'm giving designed by a committee for docent training purposes. That we're training 50 volunteers associated with the Valley of the Moon State Parks in the next several weeks to come. And people are getting involved in helping the state parks keep those 3 parks that I used to work in and supervise open rather than let them close down July 1st. And after my presentation on Jack London history, I'll talk a little bit about the efforts to keep Jack London's park open. But I'd like to begin by explaining why I need to interpret the history of Jack London. Why can't I just sort of tell you about it? Well, we call it interpretation because there's so many different stories. It's not just one story. There's not just a plain set of facts. The facts always seem to undergo transformation. So you can actually pick among several sets of stories to tell about any famous person, about any person. But a really interesting person becomes even more challenging to corral into one agreed upon story. So the history, of course, as we've been told by scholars, is in some ways a lie agreed upon by the experts. The only 2 things you need to know about Jack London are that he was born and that he died. The reasons for his early death, he was only 40 years old when he passed away, can be seen in both hands. In one he holds a pencil, and in the other he holds a cigarette. We'll talk more about that as we go along. He really was an avid writer. He wrote just about every day. I think maybe he took 1 day a week off, and he wrote over 1,000 words a day before he allowed himself to go about the rest of his day. And because of that, he was able to publish half 100 books in a short 16-year writing career. The book plate on the left, Jack London with the wolf head, Jack's nickname was Wolf because he became famous by writing about wolves. Those cigarettes, 2 packs a day. The other thing you need to know about any famous person is who is their mother and who is their father. Well, we hit the daily double with Jack. He has 2 mothers and he has 2 fathers. First is Flora Wellman from Massillon, Ohio. Wealthy family, born in 1843, well-educated, somewhat headstrong, and sickly. I guess she didn't like Ohio. She liked San Francisco much better. Interesting choice of profession. Jack London wrote about such things, but he didn't necessarily enjoy growing up in a household where seances were conducted. The other interesting fact about Flora is that She was despondent when she was pregnant with young Jack and attempted to take her own life by putting a gun to her head. Fortunately, she failed. The second mother, kind of a foster mother or surrogate mother, was Jenny, Virginia Prentice. Because of Flora's poor health, Jack was nursed by a neighbor, Virginia, who lived down the street from Flora Wellman. And this began a relationship that lasted all of Jack's life. And you know you've got a real friend when they'll loan you $300 to engage upon a life of crime. Oyster pirating was that practice of snatching the oysters from the commercial beds in San Francisco Bay just before they were ready to be harvested by the people who owned them. Jack's two fathers, William Cheney. By all rights, Jack London's name should have been John Cheney. This is a business card belonging to Professor W.H. Cheney. His address is crossed off and another one's stamped on there. What you can't read, the fine print at the bottom, says that he'll give you oral declinations, I believe is the word, for $1. And if you want them in writing, they'll cost you $5. He was born in 1821, studied politics, journalism, and the law. And here we come across the reason why he and Flora became associated. They met in San Francisco. One an astrologer, the other a seance medium. By all accounts, Mr. Cheney, Professor Cheney was a ne'er-do-well, a rascal, someone who had to change addresses often. Tarred and feathered and driven out on a rail. This sounds like an exaggeration, but all accounts in the biographies claim this for the fellow. So Jack's father, William Cheney, never took responsibility for his sons. He left town, leaving Flora to give birth to young Jack London. And Flora was helped out by this kindly fellow, John London, who himself had been quite well versed in taking care of a family. Had moved out to the West Coast after his wife died. Had a large family that included some daughters. And he married Flora and took on young Johnny, who then became called Jack as his own, hence the name Jack London. I'm calling Jack London Sonoma County's, or the Sonoma Valley's, favorite son, even though many places claim him. He was so widely traveled that if you go to Hawaii or the Klondike or elsewhere in the South Seas, you run into places where he spent time. If you go to the Oakland waterfront, you'll find that he has dozens of houses that he lived in. But he was, wanderlust was what really controlled him. He had no place that he really called home at first. Some of his many faces included that of a writer. Here he is in Japan in 1904, covering the Russo-Japanese War. He was highly sought after as a socialist lecturer. And the least known aspect of his life was his dedication to the very homespun activity of farming. And we'll cover a little bit of all of that. By all accounts, a remarkable life that he led. He always used to like to tell the story about how poor he was, how he couldn't get enough to eat, enough meat on the table. And yet he was able to break through. Imagine publishing 51 books, 19 novels, 188 short stories in such a short period of time. It has been said of Jack London, the most exciting story he ever wrote was the one that he lived. That basically all he had to do was write about his life. And he was able to become popular, one of America's best-selling authors, widely translated around the world, even in his own time. He was quite proud of this fact. He sent telegrams to Rudyard Kipling, H.G. Wells, other contemporaries, asking them how much they got paid. He'd get 13.5 cents a word, top, for a story he would serialize in Cosmopolitan magazine in 1913. You may have heard of it. It's called Valley of the Moon. And I keep coming back to the extraordinary fact that he did all this in 40 years. Young Jack, he got started early. Jenny loaned him that $300 so he could buy the sloop Razzle Dazzle and embark on that life of crime. And then what do? You turn the table, right? You say, I know all the tricks. I'm going to start arresting these guys and turning them in. Get rid of the competition. This was the California Fish Department. It's now still in existence, and it's known as the Department of Fish and Game. One of its earliest wardens was this brash young teenager who couldn't get enough of adventure. The San Francisco Bay couldn't hold him. He booked passage aboard the Sophia Sutherland when he was 17 years old as an able-bodied seaman and sailed all the way to the Sea of Japan, where he experienced typhoons while hunting seals. Came back from that, rested for a day or two, and then struck out for Niagara Falls and Washington, D.C. He was part of an industrial army, Coxey's army, that was marching in the 1890s to petition Washington, D.C. for jobs. Sounds like, what, 2008? He survived that month in jail, learned a few lessons about life, and came back home to San Francisco and headed out as soon as he could looking for gold in the Klondike. There's a popular biography of Jack London called Sailor on Horseback by Irving Stone. Jack was a lifelong sailor. He owned these different boats at different times of his life. His really favored environment was on the water, not really on the land so much, except at the very end when he became an actual sailor on horseback, because he traded in his boats for horses in the Sonoma Valley. Young Jack. I mentioned about a dozen different residences in Oakland that they continually moved from one to another, trying to make a living, truck farms. Young Jack worked in factories, canning factories, threading spindles in sewing factories. The obligatory school photo when everyone got dressed up in their finest. There's Jack, front row center. He didn't like school that much. He liked reading, though, a heck of a lot. When you're traveling around and adventuring as much as he does, you don't have a lot of time for formal education. But he saw the necessity for it. He knew he had to become educated, that the life of a work beast was not going to do for him. So he tried. He enrolled in the University of California. But he ran afoul of the professors there who he felt didn't know that much about life. So he dropped out. But he never gave up on the books. And in fact, he got his start as a reader in the Oakland Public Library, under the tutelage of the librarian at the time, who was Ina Coolbrith. And here's mother number 3, the one who directed his readings in the library. She saw that he was just going up to the shelves and pulling books willy-nilly and reading them, maybe going from A to Z. And she brought some order to that education, that self-education. She herself was an interesting and important figure in California history, and became California's first woman poet laureate in 1915. Her name is carved on the State Library in Sacramento. Well, back to education by the seat of your pants. Jack London was going to make it rich in the Klondike like a lot of other Californians. In order to do this, you had to book passage, leave home, uproot, sell all your possessions, and then buy a lot of grub. The Mounties in the Klondike wouldn't let you look for gold unless you brought a ton of equipment with you, all of this equipment which you had to personally pack up and down or up the Chilkoot Pass to your embarkation areas. Now these 100 to 150 pound packs on your back several times to get that ton of goods up there, that was quite a feat. And here we see young Jack halfway up on one of his many trips. Interestingly enough, Jack and his company got there just in time for winter to set in. The ground froze solid. They couldn't get a pick into it. They sat around in a cabin for 3 months. Jack got scurvy and had to be sent home in a boat. So much for making a living off of gold mining. Of course, he mined that experience for a lot of stories, which he turned into a bonanza, but we'll get to that. The socialist Jack London. The experience in Niagara Falls where he got arrested trying to see, that spectacular sight and made to break rocks in the Erie County Penitentiary for a month radicalized him. It turned him from just, an average thinker into what he thought of himself as a fire-breathing radical socialist. He would get up on a soapbox and they'd have to drag him down. He was highly sought after, kind of a scintillating speaker with a sparkling personality, boyish good looks, and in fact, he really was a boy. He ran for political office, although not seriously. The worst thing that could have happened would have been him getting elected to any office. I think he got less than 1,000 votes. So easy for me to poke fun at him. I've got less votes than that. This is a visual interlude for you while I take a sip of water. Talking about Jack's red career, there's a story that I heard recently that people who didn't like Jack London's philosophy, that he was a red communist or a socialist, didn't want his land that he owned to become a state park in the 1950s because of the House Un-American Activities Committee scare that was going on. And at one point, there's a gravestone up at the park where London's ashes are buried. It was said that someone came up in the middle of the night and completely painted the rock red. It's already a red volcanic rock, but that seems a bit over the top to me. This story, The Red One by Jack London, published in 1916, is one of his most fascinating stories. A short story about people from outer space who come and deposit this brilliant red orb in the top of an island, Guadalcanal, in the South Pacific, and how the natives there deify it, and how a butterfly collector goes stark raving mad just contemplating it. So Jack London wasn't just the guy who wrote about dogs. Anyway, back to history. The socialist platform. The fire-breathing radicals of those days included people who were, wore suits and ties and were very civilized and civil to one another. They simply wanted to collectivize ownership of public utilities. They didn't even want to nationalize the banks, but they did want public works for the unemployed and pensions, such things as Medicare and Social Security that eventually came to be true. Shorter work week, a day off, that would be good, right? Industrial standards whereby you could work safely. And maybe not make children work as hard as Jack remembered working. And give women the vote, for heck's sake, right? Anyone against any of these things? So you get arrested for getting up on a soapbox and talking about these things, but that's what Jack did. He also wrote about them. His most popular writings were not about socialism, but about the Klondike. He was self-taught. He didn't take any writing courses. He just learned by doing. And he studied their style, how they did it. He made sure that he learned all the tricks. He would write from morning till night. He got better and better and better at it. And there's nothing that he wouldn't take a shot at. Whatever would sell. The first thing that he ever got money for was a story of his time when he was the sailor in Japan, writing about a typhoon. $25 was a lot of money in 1893. He wrote for his school newspaper, and the very first published work he got paid for was a mere $5, which he had to collect from the Overland Monthly magazine in San Francisco. They didn't want to give it to him. He had to go visit the editor and kind of shake it out of him. And he was no overnight success. Hundreds of rejections. There is a display in the House of Happy Walls Museum. It's one of my favorites. It says Jack London got over 600 rejection slips in his career. And it has samples of them from people like that. Mr. D. Young telling him, "Son, you're never going to make it. Don't give up your day job." 1898, $5 and 44 rejection slips in that year. He kept track of all this. He had a little notebook. He wrote it all down. It cost a lot of money to mail these manuscripts to New York City and then have them just automatically be put on a conveyor belt and sent back to him. Got $40 for 1,000 deaths in 1899. 266 rejection slips. Think about that. How many of you have been turned down 266 times in 1 year? Wouldn't that take its toll? Think you'd give up? Maybe try something else? Well, not Jack. He got a lot of money for a story in 1899, but, not enough to make a living yet. But his name was beginning to become known. The hard road to success, about to turn green. 1900 saw the publication of Jack's first book, The Son of the Wolf, a collection of those short stories based on his Klondike adventures. It was also the year that he decided to settle down. He sought out Bess Mattern because he figured it was time to get married. It was not a romantic relationship. He just said, it's time to get married. He also met Charmian Kittredge, who was the secretary at the Overland Monthly magazine that had first published his first story. She was part of the crowd that he ran with in Oakland, the artistic crowd that used to have literary evenings around the Bay Area. And Jack London's name got to be known. Made a lot of money in 1900, $2,500. Now you got to multiply these figures by what, 100 or so to get an idea. A good wage in those days was $1 a day. And yet, with success came more rejection. Just less of it. Bessie Mattern. Now I mentioned what? 2 fathers, 2 mothers. Well, we're going to get to the 2 wives now. Bessie was very attractive. She's a very serious person. She was not swashbuckling and full of wanderlust like her husband, Jack. They got married in April. And the relationship was only to last for a short time. Another book was published in 1901, The God of His Fathers. Another collection of short stories based on that failure in the Klondike to find any gold. Well, imagine all the money that he found in the form of book royalties. First daughter, Joan, is born. So we're back to 2s again. He's going to have a second daughter in another year. Made a little bit more money. Published 3 more books in 1902. Children of the Frost, yet again, more Klondike adventures. The Cruise of the Dazzler, about his adventures looking oyster pirating on the San Francisco Bay. A Daughter of the Snows, about a superwoman in the Klondike. Something that Jack London was really fond of was larger-than-life figures, trying to capture them in their war against the elements. He traveled to England on his way to cover the Boer War for the Hearst newspapers. It was going on at the time, but the war ended by the time he got to London. So he decided to just stay in London and write about the coronation of the king, and also check out the slum conditions in the East End of London, and wrote a book about it called People of the Abyss. While he was gone, his second daughter, Bess, was born. People of the Abyss refers to the submerged tenth. We talk about the 99% and the 1%. Well, back in those days, they talked about the 10%, the submerged tenth that were at the bottom of the social ladder, those downtrodden people who could not get up. Jack London became one of them for a period of time. He took his camera, he photographed them, and he wrote an essay about their plight. In the year 1903, that book was published, People of the Abyss, along with a couple of others. His favorite book of the three, Call the Wild, The Kempton Waite Letters, and People of the Abyss, was People of the Abyss. It was his favorite because it took so much out of him to write. He felt it was his most important book, but the critics did not agree. They seized upon that other book, The Call of the Wild, the story of Buck, the super dog, who gets kidnapped from the Santa Clara Valley and taken up to the Klondike and enslaved and made to pull heavy sleds bearing 1,000 pounds. Call of the Wild's never been out of print since 1903. It basically made Jack London a superstar overnight. You know, overnight, 266 rejection slips. Remember that. And when it comes a classic illustrated comic, you know you've hit the big time. But things are not going well at home. He separates from his wife, Bessie. He has his two daughters, Becky and Joan. The Joan there on the right, frowning, took after her father in that she grew up to become a socialist and a writer. And in fact, she wrote one of the better biographies of Jack London called Jack London and His Times. The Sea Wolf is one of my favorite Jack London books, written in 1904, about a psychologically deranged sea captain who terrorizes his crew in a voyage across the Pacific. Jack was capitalizing on his popularity by shipping out to cover the war in Japan for the Hearst newspapers, and at the same time getting a divorce from Bessie, or filing for the papers. Anna Strunsky was named as the other woman. It was a bum rap. She was a friend of Jack's who lived on the East Coast. Together they had written a book together about romantic love, but they had no real physical relationship. But she was the one named as the other woman. So, Jack had a way of getting the story where all the other reporters got kept in the hotel room in Tokyo. Jack would sneak out the balcony, hire a sampan, cross the Sea of Japan, get to Korea, and actually file a real story. He got arrested for it, not obeying orders. Teddy Roosevelt had to bail him out of jail. They made him stay in his hotel. He was famous, though. He was the guy that wrote Call the Wild that was already getting translated into foreign languages. People clamored in the back of his hotel room for him to come out and take a bow on the balcony. And he was famous for something else very strange. He was known to have false teeth. And the people were calling for him on the balcony. He came out and he asked the translator, "What are they all saying?" And they're all saying, "Show us your teeth." Now, this is an apocryphal story, but I've read it in several biographies. So he took them out and he just showed it to the crowd, and they were happy. Strange thing about fame. Now we get to the real other woman, Charmian Kittredge, educated in Oakland at Mills College. She was an accomplished pianist, seamstress, and stenographer. So she was also full of the devil. Or the Dickens. I guess that's the term they used in those days. She was Jack's best friend and soulmate and the real reason for the divorce. In 1905, London published 3 more books: War of the Classes, The Game, and Tales of the Fish Patrol. He also bought property in Glen Ellen. Charmian's aunt happened to own a vacation spot in Wake Robin Lodge, it was called. In this particular image, the right-hand side would be where Glen Ellen is located, and Jack London visited this area and bought it, 129 acres. and he began plans for building, well, there was a little cottage right there where he lived, and he began plans for building a wolf house down here in this little grove. And the top of the mountain, Sonoma Mountain, is there. If you're wondering where we are, the "you are here" would be somewhere next to Bennett Ridge in Oakmont. So London became interested in farming and the land. He'd seen a bit of the world, and now he'd seen a bit of Sonoma County that he really liked it a lot better than Oakland. And he and Charmian began to make plans. The moral outrage factor is not to be underestimated. People like Jack London were superstars in those days. They didn't have movie actors and things like that for their scandals. They had writers. And everything he did made the newspapers. The fact that he divorced one wife to marry another did not go well with the population, with the public. So what do? You leave the country for a little while, let things simmer down. London was interested in making his Sonoma ranch his new home. So he started building a barn. First thing you do is you build the barn, then you build the house. Happened to be 1906 when he began building this barn. And on April 18th, something happened to his barn, and that was it fell down in the earthquake. It hadn't been built very tall yet. It was just the lower stone stories that collapsed. He rebuilt it. It's still there today. It's not in the park, though. It's privately owned. Jack published 3 books in 1906. White Fang, of course, is still popular today. Oh, don't worry, we're okay. But the big one, it's still celebrated to this day, every year on its anniversary in San Francisco. It, of course, decimated Santa Rosa as well as San Francisco. Jack was knocked out of bed at something like 5:15 in the morning. And he and Charmian decided they would get up and see what damage was done and start recording it. They were both accomplished photographers, so they had their cameras and they were just shutterbugs. They took pictures of everything. First they went to Santa Rosa and then they went to San Francisco. And they saw firsthand the disaster and recounted it in eyewitness accounts. And the lesson that London drew from it mostly was that the next time he set about building something, he was going to do it much differently and pay a lot more attention to details that would make it a house that would last for a longer period of time. Before Adam, 1907, The Love of Life and The Road. The Road is a recounting of Jack London's hoboing adventures across the United States. Before Adam, well, it's about someone who dreams and goes back into past lives, throwback to those times when people lived in the caves. And The Love of Life, a collection of short stories, again, capitalizing on his Klondike adventures. There was one particular, the signature story in Love of Life was one that was famous. When Lennon was on his deathbed, he read that story and just nodded and said, "Yes, Jack London, great writer." Already an accomplished writer and building his house at home, he decided, you know what? It's time to go on a round-the-world cruise. So they planned a 7-year trip around the world, and they were going to make their publishers pay for it. It wasn't going to cost them a dime. They were going to see it all and design their own boat. It would be the perfect boat. It would have everything they wanted in a boat. They spent a lot of time designing it and coming up with all the details. What it would be able to do. 8 knots under power, I put that in red. Didn't really work out. But imagine that, it would go faster under sail than by engine. And it would only cost them $7,000. Now, of course, San Francisco was rebuilding after an earthquake, and supplies were in short demand. So, of course, the price skyrocketed. Imagine paying $30,000 for a boat, which is what they ended up paying. But it was going to be worth it. The Snark, of course, is from The Hunting of the Snark by Lewis Carroll, a nonsense poem about something half snark and half snail and half shark. Maybe they shouldn't have named this boat that, because it didn't work out. Well, what did go wrong? Well, everything went wrong. There were long delays. Materials, of course. Everyone needed materials to rebuild San Francisco. Well, and then it wouldn't sail in a straight line or heave to. It had to go into waves backwards. Those engines, there's more than one, never worked right. They ended up lashing them to the deck for ballast. Airtight compartments, forget about it. Not only did it leak seawater, the gasoline leaked into all of the food provisions. They hired Charmian Kittredge's uncle, who ended up, although he looked like a grizzled old sea captain, didn't know how to navigate. And somehow or other they made it to Hawaii, where they had to completely rebuild the boat. But she looked good on the water. So in 1907, April 23rd, took them about a month to get to Hawaii, and they spent 5 months recuperating. Just like any tourist, they loved Hawaii. London wrote about the lepers of Molokai after spending a couple of weeks on Molokai Island, where the colony had been established. He sort of debunked the myth about the contagion factor of the disease and about the conditions under which people lived there. He was widely liked by the Hawaiians because he was championing their causes. And after rebuilding the Snark, they made their way for a traverse across the Pacific Ocean. Scrapbook photo that Charmian used to keep, April 22nd, 1907, was sailing day. Good-looking couple, right? On board. So their captain couldn't navigate. London had to take the sextant and teach himself on the way to Hawaii. He, of course, had sailed before. He just had never been the captain before or navigated before. But he figured it out. He was a smart guy. Didn't have any choice. He had to. Turns out first mate ended up being Charmian. She was the most seaworthy person on board. They had a crew of about six landlubbers, all of whom got seasick, spent a lot of time in the cabins below, and left poor Charmian up above to pilot the boat. But she loved it. Blue Hawaii. And are those socks they're wearing? I guess so. They were shutterbugs. They took pictures of everything. You can't read that, but I will. A study of swirls. Charmian photos the man-eaters and the Solomons. Jack not far behind her with his camera. She's also got a gun on her hip. There she is, among the islanders with a gun on her hip. This photo was sent back home and scandalized people once again. They brought a lot of music with them. They brought a lot of Kodak film, a lot of Caruso singing opera, and a gramophone. And of course, they were very popular everywhere they went. The Iron Heel, one of London's political books, published in 1908. Everyone got sick on this cruise. A year into it, they were suffering from the yaws. Sounds bad, doesn't it? Yaws. Well, all it is basically is a mosquito bite that gets scratched, infected, And then the secondary infection takes over, kind of a spirochete that creates symptoms similar to syphilis. Very alarming. In order to treat this disease, they took corrosive sublimate, an ointment, untested, that contained mercury chloride, and rubbed it right on the open sore. Anyway, in the middle of the voyage, they went home to take care of some financial matters, booked passage on a freighter, then came back out to continue the adventure, and ended up in Australia. But they were all sick by this time. I don't know. They look a little strung out and vacant-eyed to me there in 1909. And he's got that cigarette going as usual. But they're pretty much at the end of this round-the-world voyage after getting to Australia. He never stopped writing, though. They had a typewriter on board. So the stories kept coming. And they gave up on the cruise, came back home, sold the boat. That was a net loss of what? $25,500. But when you're the top paid writer of your day, I guess you can afford adventures or misadventures like that. And he threw himself into developing his beauty ranch. He also threw himself into publishing books, getting a lot of them caught up so he could make money. Burning Daylight's one of my personal favorites. It's the story of again, set in the Klondike at the beginning, about someone who strikes it rich, but then loses the fortune among Wall Street sharks and ends up back in California, where all he's got is this dirt poor farm in the Sonoma Valley where he retires to and scratches out a living on the land with his beloved. It's a great story. At that same time, Charmian delivers her first child by Jack, named Joy, who unfortunately only lived for 38 hours. Charmian was to have another 2 miscarriages before she would give up on having children. More books, and the beginning of work in building the Wolf House, Jack London's dream house. The Cruise of the Snark. How could you not tell that story? The first chapter is titled The Inconceivable and the Monstrous. All about contractors' fees. Nothing went right. But yet, it ended up being probably the most important adventure in his life. He ended up writing more stories about the South Seas than he did about the Klondike. Hard to believe, but that's true. Not that they were quite as popular or sold as many copies, but he mined that experience for a wealth of detail and story that people still read today. London's moved into the little ranch cottage while they were building the Wolf House in 1911. Here they are on the front stoop, inviting people to come pay them a visit. This little house was not meant to be their final residence. It's just how it worked out. They were building their final residence. And it looked more like this. Albert Farr was an architect from San Francisco. As it turns out, Jack has grown up next door to him in Oakland. Maybe that's how he knew of him. House was to be magnificent, in a word. There is the architect. Same school as Julia Morgan and Ernest Maybeck. The arts and crafts style is their forte. 1911, they began serious construction. 15,000 square feet, just a little bit of space there. A view out over Sonoma Valley, all the way to the town of Sonoma, 10 miles away, using materials carefully selected for their imperviousness to fire. Also built on a foundation that would have held a 40-story building that would allow the building to shift in an earthquake. 26 rooms. Think that's enough? 9 fireplaces? For a cool $50,000. Jack reading the plans, sitting on the pergola, looking out over the Sonoma Valley. And writing books to pay the bills. As much money went out as came in. In fact, more went out than came in. But they never stopped. They never stopped to rest. While doing one thing, they were always busy traveling, doing another. They booked passage and sailed around the Cape Horn. Smoke Blue Tales, A House of Pride, Son of the Sun, 3 books that year, and Charmian Miscarries. But the house is nearly ready until the bad year, 1913. Jack's only 37 years old. His house is just about ready to move into. He's got the books coming out as fast as they can come. The Valley of the Moon, remember I mentioned he got 13.5 cents a word for that? Because it was first serialized in Cosmopolitan magazine. Then, when that was done, he sells it to Macmillan and gets paid a second time. That's how you did it in those days. John Barleycorn, Alcoholic Memoirs, all about someone who drinks and cannot control the drink, and the drink gets the upper hand. And finally, giving into it, the writer says, I am a slave to alcohol. I am no longer in control. I'm in favor of suffrage because I know if women get the vote, they'll ban alcohol and they'll begin me on my way to repair and to a healthy life. This is really some of the thinking that went into the writing of this book. But it was a bad year. Jack London had his appendix out. That's bad enough. But while they had him on the table, they discovered that his kidneys were profoundly damaged beyond repair. Not that they did any repairs in 1913. No dialysis, no transplant. They had one thing for him, and that was called morphine. And then, August 22nd, 1913, Wolf House, destroyed by fire. By a fire that somehow got started in that little corner there in the basement, dining room, by a fireplace. Timbers askew, the red tile roof all gone, collapsed inside. And what caused it, they think? Nothing more complicated than some oily rags left unattended that burst into flame spontaneously, coated with turpentine and linseed oil in 105-degree weather, middle of August in the Sonoma Valley. You can take a rag out there today and just leave it for a few hours and it'll burst into flame. And they only had $10,000 worth of coverage. A big loss, an emotional loss, physical and emotional loss. They, of course, were going to rebuild, but deficit financing, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the materials. The wood, the redwood with the bark left on it that was fireproof, that would take 2 years to cure before they could rebuild. But they didn't have the time, at least Jack didn't have the time. The books continue to come. Jack continues, despite poor health, to try and write and to travel and be a war correspondent, this time in the Mexican Revolution. But he becomes too ill to continue. Dysentery, rheumatism. He takes to his boats as a way of trying to make himself healthy, going to Hawaii, to the Sacramento River, cruising wherever he can. Scarlet Plague and The Star Rover in 1915, a couple more books. The Star Rover is a very interesting collection of out-of-body experiences, astral projection, traveling through different incarnations that Jack London envisioned his character having while straitjacketed at San Quentin prison. Quite fascinating book. It's still in print. You look into that one. Jack himself was in declining health. Spent time in Hawaii. And in 1916 published The Little Lady of the Big House. The Big House was very much like the Wolf House. And the Little Lady was very much like Charmian. Jack London dies November 22nd of severe uremia. And as I keep saying, he was only 40 years old. This is his grave site in what is now the State Park in Glen Ellen. one of the red volcanic stones left over from the building of Wolf House, covered with moss. He really didn't want anything else. He didn't want his name on it, but his friend, Finn Froelich, a sculptor, did go up and carve his name on top of that rock. So in 40 brief years, London was not cheated. He accomplished more than most people do in twice that time. When he was asked by a reporter about a month before he died why he was working so hard, he appeared to be in bad health at that time, he answered, well, the doctors said, take it easy, give up my diet of half raw meat, stop smoking, and just take the morphine, but I just decided I would live the way I wanted to live. I would rather be ashes than dust, he said. I would rather that my spark should burn out in a brilliant blaze than that it should be stifled by dry rot. I would rather be a superb meteor, every atom of me in magnificent glow, than a sleepy and permanent planet. The proper function of man is to live, not to exist. I shall not waste my days in trying to prolong them. I shall use my time. So that's Jack London's credo. That's the way he lived his short life, and that's the way he wanted to be remembered. This oak tree stands next to Jack London's cottage at Jack London State Historic Park, an old coast live oak that's hundreds of years old. And Jack London's plate of the wolf, Jack's nickname the wolf, hovers there. And I wanted to leave time to cover some other subjects, so I'm going to move on at this point from Jack London to the status of Jack London State Historic Park and also other parks in the Sonoma Valley. So I got to change hats, not that I'm wearing one, from just an old retired ranger who loves to talk about Jack London to the president of the Valley of the Moon Natural History Association, which is a group of volunteers who've been operating in the Sonoma Valley for 35 years as a public benefit corporation. That's what we call nonprofits these days. That exists just to enhance the visitation to state parks by providing educational literature, maps, displays, helping train volunteers, docents who lead guided tours around the parks. So we cover Annandale, Sugarloaf, and Jack London. And on May 13th of last year, state parks announced that they would be closing all three of them by July 1st of this year. So our association, which basically only exists because of the existence of those three parks, was put on notice that we had less than a year to figure out what we could do to help the state parks stay open. It seemed that perhaps all we would need to do is write the governor a letter saying, open your eyes, look around, look at this this valley. What are you doing? You can't close these parks. Merchants depend on them for their livelihood. Visitors depend on them for their emotional and their mental health, let alone their physical recreation. How can you close a park like Annandale, 5,000 acres surrounded by housing, basically? And how can you close a historic park whose writer was so famous that his books had never been out of print, that he is translated into 90 different foreign languages, and that the state historic monument is also considered a national historic monument? So we wrote these letters. We wrote them to the governor. We wrote them to the legislature. And we didn't get a lot of good answers back. We were told that there was a $22 million budget cut that the state parks had to swallow, and this was the only way they were going to be able to do it. So we said, well, what could we do about it? And we were told that, well, Jared Huffman was going to promote a bill allowing nonprofit groups like yours to actually consider taking over operation of the park to keep them open. So we began drafting our proposal as soon as we heard that, and we submitted it back in November as a way of just keeping Jack London Park open and operating the way that it has been in the past, but in a somewhat reduced form, insofar as we would have to keep it closed a couple of days a week, and also defer a lot of maintenance on old historic buildings that are in need of new roofs or foundations or seismic retrofitting to keep them standing in the event of earthquakes. Now, these are all things that the state parks have been meaning to fund and do for the, for the buildings for some time, since they became a state park back in 1960. However, that funding has not been made available by the legislature, and back in November of the previous year, there was a ballot measure that passed locally that would have funded state parks, but failed statewide significantly. So the legislature felt there was not support for keeping the parks open. But they are entertaining our proposal now, and we are on the verge of signing a final agreement to begin operating Jack London State Historic Park as almost like a concessionaire would operate a unit, or a county or a city would operate a unit of the state park system for the state of California. So we're looking forward to that challenge, and we're going to need a lot of help from the community, which has been forthcoming already. There are other groups that have formed the Parks Alliance for Sonoma County that have come to the fore. Sonoma Land Trust, the Open Space District, the Sonoma Ecology Center, the Sonoma County Trails Committee, several others that are banding together to pool their resources to come up with ways to keep not just Jack London open, but Sugarloaf Ridge open and Annandale open. Sonoma County Parks is proposing to take over operation of Annandale. There's also the stewards of the river and coast that are planning to keep open Austin Creek, which is on the closure list. And there's also a group at Petaluma Adobe that's raising funds there to keep that open as well. Now, these are short-term solutions for this upcoming year. The question is what happens after that year if we're successful in keeping the parks open for that, for the time being. Is the state going to step back in and take over? Well, these announced closures last year didn't say temporary, they said permanent, which is what really got our attention. We can't really envision someone walking away from a state historic park of the significance of Jack London's with its 10,000 artifacts, irreplaceable artifacts, somehow being put away in storage somewhere and not being open to, for example, school children of California to come and visit. So our model for the future is to try and come up with an operating plan that will be sustainable, that will use community resources, whether it be from special events going on, such as Transcendence Theater Company putting on a series of 14 performances starting this summer at Jack London Park on a venue located in the old winery ruin, so that will be available. And also other special events that could perhaps happen on the 2 days that the park is closed. All the ways to make up the missing revenue to keep enough people on a payroll to do the necessary maintenance and patrol and care of the facilities and paying of the utilities that are necessary to keep the park functioning. So we're hopeful about that, but we can use your help. Donations to the state park at Jack London can be made through the Valley of the Moon Natural History Association. Donations of labor. Our volunteers have been great in the past, providing guided walks. In the future, they'll probably be asked to provide entrance station operation, litter pickup, and some light maintenance. So things apparently are going to change. For my part, I wrote a book about Jack London's Wolf House, which I'm selling here today. It's $13.50 with tax. All of the proceeds from that go to the Valley of the Moon Natural History Association to help keep the state parks going. There is an April 29th fundraiser coming up at Jack London Park, actually next door at Benziger Winery, that you can sign up for online if you go to, say, or jacklondonpark.org, and you can see the details on that if you want to come and have a good time at the park and also support it. So you'll be reading more and more about events like that being scheduled in the very near future, because it's going to be all of the parks that are on the closure list struggling to stay open, asking for your help and support. So now, it's your turn. I've been talking for a long time.
I wonder if we have any questions today. Do we? Jerry, do you have a question? Oh. How did I know that?
It's automatic.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Not too long ago, I actually saw a movie on Jack London. It was a 1963 movie with William O'Shea, I think it was, and Anne Bancroft. Anyway, my question is, in the movie, he showed a lot of resentment toward Japan, and I was wondering why all of this resentment toward Japan. This is long before World War II, rather. So I just was wondering why at that time.
So was it the Michael O'Shea movie? Rather than William O'Shea? Yeah. You saw it in 1963? Or you say it was made in 63?
That was when it was made.
Okay, maybe it was a Turner colorization, but the O'Shea movie of Jack London's life was actually made in 1949, which was a few years after World War II. And it was kind of cast in a light of propaganda against Japan, in that Jack London did write a story called The Yellow Peril from his experience in 1904 in Japan and China, where he saw the Japanese army decimate the Russians, and he became aware of the fact that the Eastern people were thought of as a race of people who could be dismissed, but that would be underestimating them. So he wrote about that. He was charged with being racist in many of his writings because he was pretty outspoken about his points of view. And he tended to kind of like some of the Nietzschean Superman theories. The Seawolf features them prominently. And because he read all over the board and held so many different conflicting ideas or theories, people have accused him of being anti-Japanese, anti-Chinese, anti-black. Although he kind of admired Jack Johnson. He covered both of those heavyweight fights. But I think what you noticed in that movie, I think Susan Hayward played Charmian and Michael O'Shea played Jack, was probably the effects of Hollywood being leaned on a little bit by the people who censored movies. They wanted the script written to show that you couldn't trust the Japanese who had just been in a war with, perhaps. Other questions?
I thought I'd mention that the Piano Club has had a couple of fundraising concerts, and there's going to be shortly some more advertising out for a concert going to be on May 12th, and so that will be coming out along to raise a few funds for the park.
Jed, thank you. That's my favorite kind of question.
In making my bicycle rounds through Annandale, I noticed that the old Ranger trailer office has been removed.
Yeah.
So where are the Rangers hanging out now in that area?
Did you notice the building up slope from where the old one was?
Yes, the new visitor center.
The visitor center is where the Rangers have now moved into. There are two back rooms to the visitor center where the supervising ranger and Ranger Bob have their offices. The visitor center is not yet open. It's just newly finished. It still has to be furnished before it will be open to the public for visits. But that, again, brings me to the suggestion that people will be able to help out by becoming volunteers and staffing that visitor center on weekends, answering questions, disseminating literature, maps, et cetera, et cetera. So look for that in months to come to happen. But yeah, we finally got rid of that old eyesore of the trailer. Yes?
Yeah, I wanted to mention on the subject of fundraising, you're going to have the wonderful Transcendence Theater group coming out to the park to do Broadway Under the Stars. We in the Oakmont Hiking Club is going to bring the theater group, at least a portion of them, out here on January the 9th to do a taste of Broadway.
Oh, great.
So we're going to be charging about $15. It'll be cabaret style. $5 of the $15 will be given to the Valley of the Moon Natural History Association.
What was the date of that again?
June the 9th. June the
9th.
Yeah.
Okay.
Saturday, June the 9th.
That's small.
Thank you.
So we hope you all come.
Yeah, please come. Attend that. Yes.
You alluded to the November ballot issue, where we asked to raise $18, I think, for a license fee and so on.
Correct.
How about a very simple idea, making it voluntary? In other words, when the state sends you your license renewal, there's a little box at the bottom that says, would you like to contribute $10 or $20 or whatever amount? Make it voluntary. I think they could raise a huge amount of money, several million, if it was on... I know a state that does this, by the way. This is not an original idea. The state of Michigan does this. There's a $10 box at the bottom. You check it, add $10 to your license fee, and it goes to the state parks. How about that as a revenue idea? That seems pretty simple and would certainly raise a lot of money.
I agree. And in fact, I believe Jared Huffman has introduced some new legislation that has a bunch of things like that on it. And one of them is, I believe, a checkbox on the income tax returns. So perhaps that'll actually happen. It's in apparently a speeded up mode to try and get it passed in this legislative session, as well as figuring out other ways to collect more efficiently the fund or the fees that are charged at parks that don't always get paid. So they're working on that. That's an excellent suggestion. Thank you. Yes?
I think that you were making a connection between the mosquito salve and the kidney damage.
Yes.
A few years ago, an opera was performed denoting Jack London as a drunk. So suggestion, do not have that opera shown. And question, what about his reputation as a drunkard? Do you think that alcohol and cigarettes killed him, or was there a connection with that salve they were using?
Well, thank you for pointing that out. And yeah, Every Man Jack, the opera, was based on, the libretto was based on 2 books that the author read. I remember attending a news conference that he gave, and it was The Call of the Wild and John Barleycorn. He says he really loved those 2 books, so he put them together, came up with this opera that portrayed London as an adventurous fellow who was drunk all the time. You know, the messages from those 2 books. But his death, we think, was from uremic poisoning, which was kidney disease based upon the deposition of those heavy metals in his system that came about during the Snark voyage. And that for someone as vigorous as him, even if he drank and smoked a lot, to be dead at the age of 40 is probably a result of poisoning of his kidneys. That is the official listed cause of death on the certificate, the death certificate. All of that is disputed by various biographers who claim that no, he took an overdose of morphine on purpose to take his own life. That was actually stated in Sailor on Horseback, Irving Stone's biography. But since that time, that one came out in 1939, it's been debunked or at least disputed by several other biographers who've done a little more research and found that London was in fact suffering from this kidney problem and taking morphine, self-medicating against the pain. The day that he died, November 22nd, 1916, they did find empty vials of morphine on the floor, and one of 6 doctors in attendance perhaps suggested that he might have taken too much of it as a way of causing his life to end that day. So you'll hear different stories.
I just wanted to say that he couldn't possibly have been a drunk all of his life and done all the things he did.
You know, you're right. I don't think you could write that many books unless you're sober. But then again, you know, another of my favorite writers is William Faulkner, and he had problems with drink. And you know, maybe we've got it backwards. I don't know. Excuse me, is this vodka? Or... But no, seriously, I agree with you.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, one more.
those words on the background of Martin Eden?
Oh, Martin Eden. Did I say Martin Eden's one of my favorite books by Jack London? I've got about 5 or 6 favorites like that. Martin Eden.
It's autobiographical.
It's semi-autobiographical. The book Martin Eden, published in 1909, is, kind of chronicles the struggle of a young man growing up on the Oakland waterfront, very rough sailor kind of guy who becomes enamored of learning and reading and literature and falls in with the crowd above his station socially and falls in love with a woman and wants to marry her who's from the upper crust, but he's too crude. But he takes on this self-improvement project and becomes, by virtue of reading, very well-read and refined, and becomes a writer and becomes extremely successful, but then becomes extremely disillusioned by his success. The rags to riches story, Martin Eden, is great. Jack London, Martin Eden, some people see a direct correlation. Spoiler alert here, at the end of Martin Eden, Martin takes his own life, commits suicide, and others who remarked upon Jack London's death said, see there, Jack London took his own life too. But London remarked that no, Martin Eden was different from himself, because even when the reviews came out, they asked him why he would do that to such a wonderful character. And he said, well, Martin just hadn't learned about socialism like I have. But I recommend that book too. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Greg, thank you so much for coming back.